Hello, I thought it might be a good idea to repeat what I did at Easter and produce a series of short studies on the passages concerning the birth of Jesus leading up to Christmas. So here is the first. It's Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. We tend to regard Matthew 1:18 as the beginning of the Christmas story, but Matthew indicates that the story really begins with Abraham and includes the generations of Jesus' ancestors listed in verses 1 to 17. In verse 18, he writes, "This is how the birth of Jesus the Christ came about." And the word translated birth is the Greek word Genesis, meaning birth or beginning or origin. And the same word is used in verse 1, the book of the Genesis of Jesus the Christ. So Matthew starts by telling us about the genesis of Jesus the Christ. Then he records the list of his ancestors. And then he says, this is how the genesis of Jesus the Christ happened. He clearly means that the story begins with Abraham. But why? What is Matthew telling us? Well, he's telling us that the birth of Jesus is not a chance event. It's not something out of the blue, not a random happening, but something planned and expected, something prepared for and awaited, something with a careful historical build-up. The whole Old Testament story of the people of Israel and their kings, their exile to Babylon, and their eventual return to the promised land. That's all part of the story of the genesis of Jesus the Christ. So the story of Jesus is not something completely new, but the continuation, the fulfillment, the climax of all that God was doing in history through the long centuries BC. And therefore, to understand its meaning and significance, we must read it against that background. It always makes more sense of the final chapter to have some understanding of all the chapters that come before. In particular, Matthew highlights 3 points of that history: Abraham, King David, and the exile to Babylon. Abraham, of course, was the forefather of the Hebrews, the people of Israel, and Jesus was born of those people, the Jews. In verse 1, Matthew calls him son of Abraham. Does this simply mean Abraham's descendant, or does it mean something more? Abraham was not only the forefather of the race. God made promises to Abraham. God promised him descendants as many as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand upon the seashore, and a land for them to live in. But God also promised that he would bless Abraham's descendants and would make them a blessing to others. In fact, through Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. In Galatians 3, St. Paul says that this promise was the gospel in its very essence. And he comments that the promise did not refer to seeds in the plural, meaning many people, but the singular seed, meaning one person, that is Christ. The promise of blessing to all the nations refers to Jesus. So in going back to Abraham and calling Jesus his son, Matthew is telling us that at last the heir of Abraham has come, the one who brings the fulfillment of God's promise to bless all nations. Matthew also calls Jesus son of David. Again, does he just mean David's descendant or something more than that? At this point, it's worth noting that Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, the list of his ancestors, is different from the list in Luke's Gospel. For one thing, Luke traces the line in reverse, starting from Jesus and working backwards. all the way to Adam, not just to Abraham. And Luke connects it with Jesus' baptism, not his birth. But more significantly, the names in the lists are the same from Abraham to David, but from David to Joseph, they are completely different. Why is that? Well, in Matthew's list, from David to Jeconiah, they're all in fact the kings of Judah, the royal line of the house of David, right up to the point where there was no longer any kingdom. Whereas the names in Luke's list after David's son Nathan are people that are unknown to us. And I think the best explanation is that Luke traced Jesus' natural descent, whereas Matthew traced the royal succession. If this is correct, then Joseph was the rightful heir to David's throne. Something that I guess you would keep very secret while someone like Herod was actually ruling in Jerusalem. After all, look how Herod responded when he heard the news that a legitimate king of the Jews had been born. Again, David was not only the forefather of the royal line, God had made promises to him as well. God had promised David that one of his descendants, his son, would reign upon his throne forever, that he would be God's own son, and that he would establish God's kingdom of righteousness, justice, and peace. In actual fact, the history of the kings was one of sin and failure. David himself was guilty of adultery and conspiracy to murder. Solomon's heart was led astray from loyalty to God to serve idols. And of the rest, only Hezekiah and Josiah were true to the Lord, while all the others went from bad to worse. In fact, that is why Israel went away into exile, and the throne of David was never restored, even when they returned. But now at last, David's true heir has come to fulfill the promises God made to David. Jesus the Christ is son of David, son of Abraham. Through him, the promises of God's kingdom on earth and of God's blessing upon all the nations will come to pass. So Jesus fulfills the promises to Abraham and David, but what about the exile to Babylon when the people of Israel were sent away from the promised land, away from the place of God's presence and his blessing? What does Jesus have to do with that? You'll have to wait for the answer until we consider verses 18 to 25. But for now, there are two surprising features about Matthew's genealogy, his list of ancestors. The first is that whereas we read repeatedly that someone was the father of somebody else, there are 5 exceptions to the rule, 5 women who are included in the list. Now, the inclusion of women is surprising enough in itself, since ancestry was always traced through the male line, but even more surprising is who they were. We might expect the venerated ancestral mothers of Israel, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, to be mentioned. But instead we have the rather dubious characters of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, whose stories are very far from exemplary. Tamar was a Canaanite, married to Judah's son, who pretended to be a shrine prostitute in order to seduce her own father-in-law. Rahab was also a Canaanite, who really was a shrine prostitute. Both Canaanites and shrine prostitutes were meant to be cleansed out from the land, and yet 2 of them are included in the ancestry of the Messiah. Ruth came from Moab, a long-time enemy of Israel, and she maneuvered a marriage for herself to a wealthy landowner by making what was really a socially scandalous approach to him by night. Uriah's wife isn't even named. Uriah himself was a Hittite and not an Israelite, and the implication is that she too is to be thought of as a Hittite like him. King David conspired to murder Uriah when she became pregnant with David's illegitimate child. So all these women were non-Israelites, and this prepares for the New Testament revelation, which is anticipated in the Old, that people of all nations are to be included among the people that God blesses, along with Israel. And in each case, there was something scandalous or at least questionable about their marital status, which prepares us for Mary's situation. Unlike them, she was an Israelite, but she was found to be pregnant before she had had sexual relations with her betrothed husband Joseph. How was that to be explained in the normal course of things? Matthew will explain in due course, but the strangeness of Mary's situation is consistent with the way that God worked in the past. The second surprising feature is the way that Joseph is referred to at the end of the list. We expect to read in verse 16, and Jacob the father of Joseph, and Joseph the father of Jesus. But instead, Joseph is deliberately not identified as the father of Jesus. Instead, he's referred to as the husband of Mary. And then we are told that she was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. Matthew makes it clear then that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus, but this creates a problem. If Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, then he must be descended from King David. According to the promises, the Messiah would be a son of David's line, who would inherit David's kingdom. So Joseph was the descendant of David and rightfully next in line to the throne. And Jesus is the heir of both David and Abraham, the one in whom the ancient promises of God's kingdom and his blessing to all nations will at last be fulfilled. But if Joseph was not actually Jesus' father, how is Jesus David's son? And again, what has Jesus to do with the exile to Babylon? The answers are found in verses 18 to 25, which is the passage that we will look at tomorrow.